Okay, so I've decided to do a quick and simple guide to the criminal justice system by way of giving you an introduction to Unit 4, particularly AC 1.2, where you have to look at all the various different agencies within the criminal justice system. So this is by way of a starting point to get your head round roughly how the criminal justice system works. And then you can use my other PowerPoints to go into more detail on each of the separate units within the criminal justice system. So without further ado, let's go through exactly what happens when an offence is committed. So to start it all off, the first thing we need to be aware of is that Parliament lays down the legislation, lays down the laws that govern every stage of this process. So this is going to appear in virtually every single slide, just to hammer the point home that ultimately the responsibility for the whole of the criminal justice system lies with the government that we elect, Parliament. So let's assume an incident has occurred. Now, if that is the case, we've ultimately got two ways this incident can go. If it isn't a crime, the incident ends there. However, if it is a crime, then we start to move through the different agencies within the criminal justice system. So if we've got a crime, there's now two possible routes that you can go down. The first one is that the crime just simply goes unreported. No one reports it to the police, and that's where it stops. And quite a lot of crimes in today's society do go unreported. They don't hit our crime figures whatsoever. However, if it is reported, it will then move on to the police. So our next stage is where we meet our first agency of the criminal justice system, the police. Remember, of course, that all the legislation that governs this process is laid down by Parliament. So the crime is reported, and it's reported to the police. And their job is to then investigate the allegation. Now, once again, this can go one of two ways. The police can investigate, and they can decide that they haven't got enough evidence, they can't find who did it, and the crime remains unsolved. And that would be recorded on the police's crime statistics. However, if they're more successful, they get some witnesses, they get some evidence, then hopefully they can arrest a suspect and they can interview a suspect. So they've got someone they think's done the crime, then we moved to the next stage. So either they can interview the subject and decide that no charge is warranted, so that he or she is released without charge, or there is what's called an out-of-court disposal, which is one of the four main sentencing things open to us in our society, and this is more like a discharge where you don't go to court, something else is done instead. But if it's a serious crime, then we move on to the next stage where we are thinking about taking the suspect to court. So, once again, Parliament lays down all the legislation governing this process, and the police have got their suspect, they've arrested and interviewed them, and now they want to go to court. But before they do that, the case is handed over to our next agency, which is the CPS, which stands for the Crown Prosecution Service. And they make a decision on what the charge is going to be, or whether the charge is actually going to be carried out in court at all. So again, the CPS has two choices here. And the CPS can decide there's not enough evidence to prosecute, or they don't think they'll get a conviction, and the case doesn't go to court. So again, it moves out of the criminal justice system. Or they can decide to charge the suspect. And once the CPS have made that decision, then we are going to move to court. And the defendant goes to court, and that could be a Crown Court, it could be a magistrate's court, and the defendant has to make a decision as to whether they are going to plead guilty or not guilty, because that then determines what happens in our next section. So as we move on, again, reminding you all that Parliament lays down all stages of this. We've gone to court. So the defendant has two choices within court. They can enter a not guilty plea, or they can enter a guilty plea. Now, if they go down the route of guilty, then a trial will follow. And if we follow the process of a trial, they can either be found not guilty at trial, be that a magistrate's court or a Crown Court, so they're acquitted, no further action is taken. However, if they are found guilty on trial, so this works for both entering a plea of guilty or being found guilty in a trial, you move through to sentencing. Now here, sentencing is also influenced by the Sentencing Council, and the Sentencing Council issue guidelines as to how courts should sentence in this country. So let's have a look a little bit about sentencing. So just a reminder there that the Sentencing Council has issued the guidelines on sentencing, and sentencing is now going to happen. So how does this work? Well, the first rule of sentencing is basically we've got four options if we count a discharge, which I mentioned earlier. You can get a custodial sentence, and that's a prison sentence, and that then becomes the responsibility of our next agency within the criminal justice system, which is Her Majesty's Prison Service, and they will take over running the custodial sentence. The court can issue a fine, in which case it's paid to Her Majesty's Court and Tribunal Service, or they can serve a suspended sentence, or they're given a community order, in which case in comes another agency of the criminal justice system, which is the National Probation Service, the NPS. Also, we have private probation companies, CRCs, which are currently about to be disbanded. But they're in here for the purposes of this PowerPoint, because at the moment of time of doing this, they're still around. So it's either a prison service, a sentence, a fine, a suspended sentence, or a community order. And each separate agency will run those. So prison, custodial, fine just gets paid to Her Majesty's Court and Tribunal Service, and if it's a suspended sentence or a community order, then the person is handed over to the MPS or the CRCs to run that sentence. So that's the case. Whether they serve a prison sentence, a fine, a suspended sentence, or a community order, ultimately, if they finish that, usually if it's a suspended sentence or a custodial sentence, they are then released on license. So you're very rarely do you serve a whole sentence. Often most inmates are released on license. And again, if someone is released on license, they're supervised by the National Probation Service and the CRCs. Now, obviously, it's a license. So if you break the terms of that license, if you breach your license, back you go to where you came. So if you breach the terms of your license, back you go to Her Majesty's Prison Service. At the same time, you can also, if you breach your license seriously, can be moved back to sentencing, where you could incur a more serious sentence. So either you come out of the system having been released on license, or you've served your time, you've done your suspended sentence, or you've done your community order, or you breach and back you go. So that's basically how it works. That is your criminal justice system. However, it's worth knowing there is one more process that links into our idea of sentencing, and that's the appeal system. So you may decide that you're not happy with your sentence and may decide to appeal, and you go to the Court of Appeal and you have an appeal hearing. Now, there are three ways this appeal can work, and this is my final slide, so hopefully this sums it all up for you. So you can be successful in your appeal and your conviction is quashed, so you no longer have to answer for anything, you are innocent, or your conviction can be upheld, so you're guilty of the crime, but the sentence is deemed to be either too lenient or too severe, so your sentence is overturned. And if that is the case, you will go back to sentencing and then go back to our previous slide, and they'll decide what sentence to give you. Once that's done, back you go with your sentencing to either your custodial sentence, your fine, your suspended sentence, or your community order. Alternatively, the final thing that can happen in an appeal is your conviction and your sentence will be upheld, in which case you go back to where you started from and off you go to prison or pay a fine or suspended sentence, etc. That is the criminal justice system in a nutshell. Obviously, my further slides, my further presentations will give you much more detail on each of those agencies, but I hope that's just given you a basic idea of how the system works in a nutshell. Very simple. Goodbye.